The cold storage room beneath the mansion's basement was bathed in pale blue light. The temperature hovered near freezing. Every breath turned to white mist. On the steel table, a man lay motionless, his skin bluish, his eyes shut tight. He looked no different from a corpse. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. And the girl trembling her way into that chamber, a syringe of antidote in her hand, was the only person in the world who knew it. Her name was Kira Donovan, 27. An orphan, a night shift nurse with nothing to her name but courage. And the man on that steel table? Conrad Ashford, the most powerful crime lord in Chicago. A man half the city feared, and the other half wanted to destroy. The person killing him slowly through poison in his IV line wasn't an enemy. It was his own brother. This is the story of the night Kara walked into that freezing vault to save a stranger, and never walked out of his world again. If you believe that sometimes the kindness of an ordinary person can change an entire empire, stay until the end of this story. And if you want to follow our next stories, subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next one. 2 weeks before that night in the cold cellar, Conrad Ashford sat in the private room behind his underground casino in Chicago's South Loop. The room had no windows, only an oak table, 2 chairs, and a silence as heavy as lead. The door opened. 2 men brought in a middle-aged man with a gray, bloodless face, sweat running down his temples. He was shoved into the chair across from Conrad. No one in the room said a word. Conrad looked at him, not with anger, not with contempt. He simply looked, with eyes so calm they made a man want to run more than any threat ever could. Then he asked, his voice gentle, as if he were asking after the man's health, "Do you have a family?" The middle-aged man swallowed and nodded. Conrad continued, "Then you should think carefully before you answer my next question." He leaned forward, slowly. "Who told you to move the money out?" The middle-aged man trembled, his eyes dropping to the floor, and then he confessed everything. Every name, every number, every transaction. When he finished speaking, Conrad gave a single nod, signaling for the men to take him away. Nothing more needed to be said. Warren Cross had stood beside him the entire time, silent as a shadow. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, a lawyer, an advisor, and the only man Conrad called Uncle. Warren watched the door close behind the traitor, then turned to Conrad. He gave up the name of the man behind it. Conrad didn't look up. I knew that name before he opened his mouth. That was Conrad Ashford, 33 years old. He had inherited the underground empire of the Ashford Syndicate at 25, after his father died. In 8 years, he had turned the organization from a chaotic network into a machine that moved with exact precision, controlling real estate, underground casinos, and black financial currents across Chicago. He didn't rule through crude violence. He ruled through silence, through information, and through the most frightening thing of all. He always knew first. That evening, Conrad attended a party at the family mansion on the shore of Lake Michigan. Garrett Ashford, his half-brother, 38 years old, stood beside Conrad all night, laughing easily, pouring wine for his younger brother, telling amusing stories for the guests. Garrett was half a head taller than Conrad, broader in the shoulders, warmer in the voice. From the outside, he looked like the perfect older brother, but behind that smile were 13 years of being pushed aside by their father, 8 years of watching his younger half-brother sit in the chair he believed belonged to him, and 13 years of swallowing resentment. No one in the ballroom knew that, not even Conrad. At midnight, Conrad rose and lifted his glass in a toast. He smiled and spoke a few brief words. Then, in the middle of an unfinished sentence, the glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the stone floor. Conrad collapsed. He didn't have time to catch himself. He didn't have time to say another word. The entire room froze for 1 second, and then chaos exploded. And the first person to rush to Conrad, to kneel beside his younger brother, his face drained with worry, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse, was Garrett. He shouted for an ambulance, his voice choked with emotion. He gripped Conrad's hand, his eyes red. Anyone watching would have seen a brother panicked because his younger brother had fallen ill. No one saw the face of the man who had done it. 5 days after Conrad Ashford collapsed at the party, he lay motionless in a VIP patient room on a private floor of Lakewood Medical, a private hospital in Chicago, comatose, unresponsive. The news reports spoke of the financial tycoon's mysterious illness, but no one was allowed to visit him except family and his private doctor. 2 large guards stood outside the hallway 24 hours a day, their faces as cold as concrete walls. And every night, when the shift changed, a nurse named Kira Donovan was assigned to care for this VIP patient. Kira was 27 years old, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her body slender, but her steps quick and decisive. She didn't know who Conrad Ashford was. To her, he was only the patient in room 47, unconscious for reasons no one had explained, with guards posted outside and a medical file locked behind special access. Kira was no stranger to long night shifts or critical patients. She had grown up in the foster care system, moved through 7 different families before she turned 18, and had to walk on her own. Not one family had ever truly treated her like their child. She learned to stand on her own very early, earned her own scholarships, worked her own part-time jobs, and made herself into a nurse. She was used to having no one on her side, so she chose to stand on someone else's. That was why she worked the night shift, because night was when patients were the loneliest, and Kira understood that feeling. On the 5th night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the VIP patient's checkup schedule said 5 o'clock, but Kira had a habit of going earlier. She pushed the medication cart down the hallway of the private floor, her nursing shoes making no sound on the polished stone. The night shift guards were dozing at the end of the hallway, their heads tilted to one side. Kira reached room 47 and lifted her hand to push the door open, then realized it was already ajar. A weak light spilled out from inside, and there were voices. Kira stopped. She recognized the first voice at once. It was Dr. Paxton Mercer, the lead physician in charge of the VIP patient. His voice was low, even, carrying the coldness of a man reading a report rather than speaking about a human life. The neural inhibitor is working according to plan. Brain activity has decreased 40% compared to the first day. At the current dosage, within 48 hours, the readings will fall low enough to declare brain death. No standard test can detect this compound. The second voice made Kira hold her breath. She didn't know who the speaker was, but that voice carried something even colder than the doctor's. A dark confidence, the kind of confidence that belonged to someone who had already decided and didn't waver. "What about the death certificate?" Paxton answered. "I'll sign it. The cause of death will be listed as complications from exhaustion. No one will ask questions. The family has already agreed to a quick burial." The second voice went silent for a moment, then spoke slowly, each word clear. "Father chose the wrong successor. I'm only correcting that mistake." Kira stepped back from the door, her hand gripping the handle of the medication cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded so violently she was afraid the 2 men inside would hear it. She turned around and moved softly down the hallway, each step feeling as if she were walking across broken glass. She had just heard a murder plot. The patient in room 47 was being poisoned, and the doctor in charge, the man who was supposed to save him, was the one killing him. Kira returned to the nurse's station, closed the door, and sat down in a chair. Her hands were still shaking. She could pretend she hadn't heard anything. She could finish her shift, go home, sleep, and wake up tomorrow morning as if nothing had happened. No one knew she had stood outside that door, but she remembered. She remembered the nights when she had lain in strange rooms, in strangers' houses, needing someone to speak up for her, and no one did. Not one person. Kira opened the computer and accessed the file for the patient in room 47. She scrolled down to the emergency contact section. One name, Warren Cross. Occupation, attorney. She wrote the phone number on a small piece of paper, her hand still trembling, but her handwriting clear. She knew this violated hospital confidentiality rules. She knew she could lose her job, lose her only source of income. But the patient in room 47 would lose his life within 48 hours if no one did anything. 5 o'clock in the morning. Kira called Warren Cross's number. The phone rang and rang. No one answered. She called a second time. Still nothing. A third time. Voicemail. Kira hung up and looked out the window of the nurse's station. Chicago had not yet awakened. The city was still sleeping beneath a gray veil of fog. She tucked the piece of paper into her scrub pocket, stood up, and told herself that when her shift ended, she would find Warren Cross herself. If the phone didn't work, she would meet him face to face. She had no plan, no weapon, no one behind her, only a small piece of paper with a phone number written on it, and the decision not to turn her back on someone who needed to be saved. When morning came, Kira finally finished her long shift. She changed out of her uniform but didn't have time to change her shoes, so she was still wearing her soft-soled white nursing shoes. Before leaving the hospital, she returned to the computer in the nurse's station one last time, opened the file for the patient in room 47, scrolled down to the emergency contact section, and copied Warren Cross's office address, a building in the Western Financial District, on West Monroe Street. Kira took the subway and stood for the entire 30 minutes, because there were no empty seats left. Her eyes burned after the long night shift, but her mind was strangely alert, as if fear had completely replaced sleepiness. She arrived at nearly 8 o'clock. The building wasn't anything like she had imagined. No sign, no company name, only an old 4-story building with a gray stone facade and dark glass doors, looking more like a small accounting firm than the office of the most powerful attorney in Chicago. But the two men standing in front of the entrance were not normal at all. Both were nearly a head taller than Kira, broad-shouldered, expressionless, standing on either side of the door like two pillars made of flesh. Kira stepped forward. "I need to see Mr. Warren Cross. This is extremely urgent, and it has to do with Conrad Ashford." The man on the left looked her up and down, taking in a tired-faced young woman with hair slipping loose from what had once been a neat bun, dark circles under her eyes, a thin coat over medical scrubs, and dusty white shoes. He said nothing. He only shook his head once. Kira added, "Please tell him that. Leave." The man on the right cut her off, his voice not brutal, but so firm there was no room left for the next sentence. Kira stood there for a few more seconds, then stepped back. But she didn't leave. She crossed to the other side of the street, stood beside a traffic light pole, and waited. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. People passing on the sidewalk glanced at her, then moved on. The two guards looked over at her from time to time, but didn't come out to chase her away again. Maybe they thought she would give up on her own. At 9:45, the glass door opened. A man stepped out, 62 years old, silver-haired, his back straight, his stride quick and steady. He wore a gray suit, no glasses, his sharp eyes fixed straight ahead. Kira recognized him at once, even though she had never met him, because he was the only person who could walk out the front door and make both guards shift slightly aside to clear his path. Kira crossed the street and hurried in front of him. "Mr. Warren Cross?" Warren stopped and looked at her. His gaze swept over Kira in less than 2 seconds, assessing, categorizing, and almost dismissing her. She saw it in his eyes, the look of a man accustomed to dealing with hundreds of people who came to him to beg, complain, or make trouble. "I don't take visitors without appointments." He stepped to one side to keep walking. "Conrad Ashford is being poisoned." Kira said it clearly, not shouting, but loudly enough for Warren to hear every word. His private doctor, Paxton Mercer, is infusing a neural inhibitor directly into his IV line. That compound suppresses central nervous system transmission, causes progressive decline in brain activity, and mimics the symptoms of a natural deep coma. Mr. Ashford's brain activity has dropped by 40% in 5 days. Within 48 hours, the readings will be low enough to declare brain death. And the person who ordered Dr. Mercer to do this is Garrett Ashford. Warren had stopped completely. He turned back to look at Kira, and this time, it wasn't a dismissive look. His eyes narrowed, studying her with total concentration. "Who are you?" "Kira Donovan, night shift nurse at Lakewood Medical. I was assigned to care for patient Ashford. Last night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I overheard a conversation between Dr. Mercer and Garrett Ashford right inside the patient room." Warren was silent for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, then he said 2 words. "Get in." He took Kira to a small cafe a 10-minute drive away, hidden in a quiet corner, with few people inside. He sat across from her, both hands resting on the table, and listened as she told him everything. When Kira finished speaking, Warren didn't react right away. He looked down at his cup of coffee, turned the spoon lightly, then said slowly, 3 days before he collapsed, Conrad called me. He said he wanted to restructure the organization, establish an independent oversight board, and cut Garrett's authority in the financial division. He suspected Garrett had been moving money out for the past 2 years. "We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday to sign the documents." He paused. But Conrad collapsed on Friday night, before he had a chance to sign anything. Everything fit together. Garrett knew he was about to lose power, and he struck first. Warren looked straight into Kira's eyes. "Do you know what kind of man Conrad Ashford is? Do you know what you're getting involved in?" Kira looked back at him without blinking. "I don't need to know who he is. I only know he's being killed, And I'm the only one who knows. Warren set his coffee cup down and looked at Kira with grave eyes. I need at least 36 hours. To mobilize people I can trust, to confirm the blood sample, to prepare an antidote if what you said is true. But the problem is that Garrett or Paxton could increase the dose at any moment. If they speed this up, Conrad won't survive tomorrow night. He paused, looking straight at her. Can you buy us more time? Kira understood what he was asking. He wasn't asking whether she was capable of it. He was asking whether she dared. She nodded. That afternoon, Kira slept for 3 hours in her small rented room in Pilsen, set an alarm, then returned to Lakewood Medical for her night shift as usual. She signed in for the shift, received the handoff from the afternoon nurse, and checked the patient list. Everything was normal. No one looked at her differently. No one knew she was carrying an empty test tube in her pocket, along with a decision that could get her killed. At 11 o'clock that night, Kira checked Dr. Paxton Mercer's duty schedule. He had left the hospital at 9 o'clock, and his return was scheduled for 6 o'clock the next morning. She had 7 hours. Kira pushed the medication cart down the VIP floor hallway. The night shift guards were the same 2 men from the night before, one sitting in a chair near the stairs, looking at his phone, the other standing near the door of room 47, but yawning widely. She tapped lightly on the chartboard in her hand and walked past them with the face of someone simply doing her routine work. No one stopped her. She pushed open the door to room 47, stepped inside, and closed it softly behind her. The room was quiet. There was only the steady sound of the heart monitor, the low hum of the infusion pump, and the very faint breathing of Conrad Ashford. He lay there, motionless, his eyes closed, his skin paler than the last time she had entered the room. Kira went straight to the infusion pump on the right side of the bed. She looked at the display showing the flow rate, dosage numbers, and the time remaining in the fluid bag. She knew she couldn't replace the bag, because Paxton would notice immediately, but there was one thing she could do that would be much harder to detect. She adjusted the infusion rate down to the lowest level the machine would allow. The action took only a few seconds. 3 button presses. The amount of inhibitor entering Conrad's body would drop by nearly 70%. Not enough to stop it completely, but enough to slow the decline in his brain activity. Enough to buy time. Kira turned to the left side of the bed and took the empty test tube from her pocket. She found a vein in Conrad's arm, tied the tourniquet gently, and drew a small blood sample. Her hands didn't shake. In moments that demanded precision, Kira Donovan never shook. She removed the tourniquet, placed a small bandage over the needle mark, and hid the tube of blood inside the inner pocket of her coat. This blood sample would be delivered to Warren's specialist to confirm exactly what compound was being used. Before leaving the room, Kira stopped beside Conrad's bed. She looked at his face. There was nothing there like the image of the powerful Mafia boss Warren had described. He was only a man lying still in a sleep he hadn't chosen, slowly dying because of someone who carried the same blood. She spoke very softly, almost without sound. I don't know whether you're a good man or a bad one, but no one deserves to be killed by his own brother. Then she turned away, stepped out of the room, and closed the door gently. She walked past the yawning guard, past the empty hallway, and returned to the nurse's station. She sat down in a chair, placed her hand over the left side of her chest, and felt her own heartbeat pounding so fast it hurt. In her pocket was a tube of blood from the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago. And if anyone discovered what she had just done, Kira knew she wouldn't live through the night. A few hours later, as dawn broke the next morning, Dr. Paxton Mercer entered room 47, exactly on schedule. He set his briefcase on the table, washed his hands, then went straight to the monitor beside Conrad's bed. He looked at the readings and frowned. Then he looked again. Conrad's brain activity hadn't declined along the curve he had projected. Compared to his projected timeline, the index should have dropped by another 15%, but the actual decrease was only about 4%. Paxton checked the fluid bag. More than 60% remained, more than usual. He looked at the infusion pump display, and the color changed in his face. The flow rate was at the lowest setting. He hadn't left it there. He was 100% certain that before leaving the hospital last night, he had checked the flow rate and set it at the standard level. Someone had entered this room and changed the settings. Paxton stood there for 30 seconds, his mind racing. Then he pulled out his phone and called Garrett Ashford. Someone interfered with the infusion equipment. The rate was lowered to the minimum setting. The process has slowed by at least 12 hours compared with the plan. The other end of the line was silent for 3 seconds. Then Garrett's voice cut in, cold and slow. Check the security cameras. Find out who entered that room last night outside the scheduled rounds. Paxton called the head of hospital security, a man Garrett had arranged to place in that position 2 years earlier. Within 20 minutes, the camera footage was pulled, clear as daylight. At 11:14 last night, Nurse Kira Donovan pushed a medication cart into room 47. The footage showed her standing beside the infusion pump, her hand working over the control panel. She was in the room for 11 minutes. When she left, her right hand was pressed against the inside pocket of her coat, holding something tightly. Garrett looked at the security footage on his phone, his face calm, but his jaw clenched. This nurse. Find her now. 2 of Garrett's men arrived at Lakewood Medical at 8 o'clock in the morning. Kira Donovan wasn't there. Her shift had ended at 7 o'clock, and she had already left. They went to her rented room in Pilsen, a small third-floor room in an old building. They knocked. No one opened. They knocked again. Still no one. They checked with the building manager and learned that Kira hadn't come home that morning. The room was empty. She wasn't there, because Warren Cross had picked her up as soon as her shift ended at 7 o'clock in the morning. He hadn't allowed her to return to her rented room alone. He had said, "From now on, you're not going home. It isn't safe." Kira didn't ask again. She understood. That decision of Warren's, though Kira didn't know it at the time, saved her life. When Garrett's 2 men returned and reported empty-handed, Garrett stood in the study of the family mansion, his back to the door as he looked down over Lake Michigan through the window. He was silent for nearly a minute. Then he turned and spoke to Paxton over the phone. "We're not waiting anymore. Declare Conrad brain dead tonight. Sign the death certificate. Transfer the body back to the mansion tonight. Burial tomorrow morning." Paxton hesitated. "The readings haven't fallen far enough to." "You're the doctor." Garrett cut him off, his voice not raised, but sharp as a blade. "Whatever paper you sign becomes the truth. Do it." Paxton went silent, then answered, "All right." Garrett ended the call and looked out at Lake Michigan. The 48-hour plan had now been cut down to 12. Someone was sabotaging him, and he didn't know who it was. He didn't know whether that nurse was acting alone or whether someone stood behind her, but it didn't matter. He would end everything before anyone had time to act. At the same time, inside a safe apartment in Lincoln Park, Warren Cross sat across from Kira. His toxicology specialist had confirmed the blood sample. It was indeed a neural inhibitor, at exactly the dosage Kira had described. An antidote could be prepared, but it would require at least another 24 hours. Warren had just received word from someone inside the hospital. Garrett had accelerated the plan. Conrad would be declared dead tonight and transferred back to the mansion. Warren set the phone down on the table and stared into empty space for 10 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in almost 2 years. The phone rang 3 times. A woman's voice answered, low, slow, and clear in every word, even though she was 78 years old. "Warren. Madame Genevieve." Warren drew in a breath. "Garrett is poisoning Conrad. I have blood test evidence, and I have an antidote being prepared. But Garrett has moved the plan forward. He's going to declare Conrad dead tonight and bring him back to the mansion. I need your people." Silence. Long silence. Kira sat across from him, watching Warren grip the phone tightly, and she understood that this call weighed more than any call he had ever made. Then Madame Genevieve's voice rose, not trembling, not wavering. "How many people?" "Enough to enter the mansion. Give me 3 hours." The line went dead. Warren set the phone down and looked at Kira. "She'll help." Kira asked, "Who is she?" Warren answered, his voice half respectful, half wary. "The only person Garrett and Conrad both fear." 3 hours after Warren's call, everything was ready. The antidote had been delivered from the toxicology specialist's lab, kept in a small vial wrapped in black cloth, tucked securely inside Kira's coat pocket. Warren explained to her how to inject it, the dosage, the vein site, and how long to wait for a reaction. Kira listened and remembered, without needing to write anything down. She was a nurse. This was something she knew how to do. 11 o'clock at night. The Ashford family mansion stood on a hill beside Lake Michigan, 40 minutes by car from downtown Chicago. Garrett had Conrad transferred from Lakewood Medical back to the mansion that afternoon, with the brain death declaration signed by Dr. Paxton Mercer, the cause listed as complications from unexplained physical deterioration. According to Garrett's plan, the burial would take place at 8 o'clock the next morning. Quick, private, with only family and a few close associates present. And Conrad, the man every document said was dead, would be taken down to the cold storage cellar beneath the mansion's basement for the night. 4 black cars moved along the road leading up to the mansion, their headlights off, only the dim glow of taillights reflecting on the wet pavement. No sound, no roaring engines. The cars stopped 200 meters from the mansion gate. Doors opened. Figures stepped out in silence, moving quickly and precisely, as if they had trained for this moment their entire lives. These were Genevieve Ashford's people. Not hired outsiders, not temporary allies. These were people who had been loyal to her since 30 years ago, when she built the Ashford empire from nothing. They weren't loyal to Conrad. They weren't loyal to Garrett. They were loyal to Genevieve. And she had called. Warren led the way, with Kira right behind him. She wore a dark coat, the inner pocket holding the antidote vial and syringe, her right hand gripping them tightly, refusing to let go. Her heart was racing, but her steps didn't slow. The mansion gate was opened from the inside by a gatekeeper, whom Genevieve had contacted in advance, a man who had been loyal to her since her husband was still alive. Genevieve's team poured into the mansion without a single gunshot. Garrett's men upstairs were overwhelmed before they could react. There was no long fight, no chaos, only complete domination through numbers and surprise. When Warren stepped into the first-floor living room, Garrett was sitting in a chair with a glass of liquor in his hand. He saw Warren, saw the men standing behind him, and the glass in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. His face changed color for a fraction of a second, then returned to calm, the forced calm of a man already calculating his next move. "Warren, have you come to pay respects to my brother?" Warren didn't sit down, didn't accept a drink, didn't offer any greeting. He said, "Where is Conrad? Conrad is dead." Garrett set the glass down, his voice low and mournful. "The doctor signed the death certificate this afternoon. You already know that. You should go home. The burial is tomorrow morning. You can. Where is Conrad?" "Garrett?" Warren repeated, his voice no louder, but heavier. Garrett looked at Warren, then at the men behind him, and he understood this wasn't a visit of mourning. His jaw tightened. His eyes went cold. "He's dead. You people are breaking into my house in the middle of the night over a corpse," Warren answered slowly. "If that's true, you don't need to shout." Garrett didn't say where Conrad was. He sat still, eyes fixed straight ahead, mouth pressed tight. Warren signaled for his people to keep Garrett in the living room, then turned to Kira. The whole team was standing in the mansion foyer, and no one knew where Conrad had been taken. The mansion had dozens of rooms, 3 floors, and a wide basement. Searching room by room would take time they didn't have. Kira stood in the middle of the foyer and looked around. She thought. The death declaration had been signed. Garrett said Conrad was dead. If he wanted to keep a body overnight before the burial tomorrow morning, he would need to preserve it. She turned to one of Genevieve's men. "Does this mansion have a cold storage room? A low-temperature preservation room beneath the basement?" One man nodded. "Yes, east basement, at the end of the concrete stairs." Kira didn't wait for anyone to go with her. She ran. And that was the very cold cellar we saw at the beginning of the story. The cellar with pale blue light, the temperature near freezing, breath rising in white mist, and Conrad Ashford lying motionless on a steel table. Kira found the faint pulse in his neck, injected the antidote, waited through the longest 30 seconds of her life, and watched his chest rise and fall again. His eyes opened, instinct reacted before consciousness returned, and his hand seized her wrist, his grip strong even though his body had been close to death. Kira didn't pull away. She looked straight into his eyes and said calmly, "You're safe now. I'm a nurse. I'm here to save you." Conrad looked at her, awareness slowly returning to his eyes. He released her wrist, his breathing heavy, his voice hoarse from the cold and the poison. "Where's Garrett?" Kira answered. "Upstairs, being held." Conrad tried to sit up, his body trembling, nearly collapsing. Kira supported his shoulder, one hand bracing his back, feeling the cold of his skin cut through her palm. She took off her coat and laid it over his chest, the only thin coat she had, its remaining warmth from her own body passing into him. Conrad looked at her, this strange woman shivering from the cold after giving him her coat, and asked, "Who are you?" Kira answered, "Someone who didn't want you to die." They brought Conrad upstairs by the concrete staircase. Warren supported one side, and one of Genevieve's men supported the other. Conrad could barely stand, his feet dragging over every step, his body still trembling from the cold and from the poison that hadn't yet left his system. Kira's thin coat was draped over his shoulders, far too small for his frame, but it was the only thing holding any warmth around him now. Kira walked behind them in silence, holding the emptied syringe in her hand, her eyes never leaving Conrad's back. When they stepped into the first-floor living room, Garrett was being held in a chair by two of Genevieve's men, one standing on each side of him. He sat with his back straight, his face calm, his eyes fixed toward the door. And when the door opened, when Garrett saw Conrad Ashford standing there, alive, breathing, his eyes open, the calm on his face broke for a fraction of a second. Only a fraction of a second. His eyes widened, his jaw dropped, and his whole body went rigid, as if he were watching a corpse walk. Then he regained control, quickly, but not quickly enough. Everyone in the room saw it. Conrad saw it. Conrad stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at Garrett. He was still leaning on Warren, his body weak, his face pale, but his eyes weren't weak at all. Those eyes were clear and cold. The kind of clear and cold that belonged to a man who understood everything without needing anyone to explain another word. Then he let go of Warren's arm. Warren tried to hold him, but Conrad removed his hand, gently yet firmly. He stood on his own. His legs shook, his knees nearly buckled, but he stood. He took 2 more steps toward Garrett, each step slow and heavy, but no one in the room dared to breathe too loudly. Conrad stood in front of Garrett. 2 brothers, same father, different mothers, same empire, different fates. Conrad looked down at Garrett sitting in the chair and asked only one question, his voice neither rising nor falling, only flat as the surface of water before a storm. Why? Garrett looked up at his younger brother. There were no tears in his eyes, no regret, only something deep and old, something that had been eating him from the inside for 13 years. He answered, each word clear, because Father chose the wrong man. Father chose the son whose mother was a servant instead of his firstborn son. I only took back what belonged to me. The living room fell completely silent. No one said a word. Kira stood near the door, holding her breath, watching the 2 brothers face each other from less than 1 meter apart, and she felt the weight of that moment. It wasn't anger. It was heavier than anger. It was the final breaking of something that had cracked a very long time ago. Conrad said nothing. He looked at Garrett. For a long time, then he turned away. He walked off, slowly, heavily, but without looking back. Garrett watched his younger brother's back moving away from him, and the last of the calm on his face shattered. He shouted, his voice rising high, hoarse and raw, echoing through the living room. Turn around and look at me! Look at me, Conrad! Conrad didn't turn around. He didn't stop walking. He didn't say another word. That indifference, that back turned away, was heavier than any punch, sharper than any threat. Garrett could endure anger. He could endure punishment. But being turned away from, being ignored as if he wasn't even worth looking at, that destroyed him from the inside. Conrad reached the doorway and leaned against the frame for 1 second to regain his strength. Then he spoke, without turning his head, his voice even and empty. Lock him up. I'll deal with him later. Conrad Ashford lay in bed in the main bedroom of the mansion, his body still not fully recovered. His skin was pale, his lips dry, and his right hand trembled slightly from time to time. The poison had left his system because of the antidote, but his body needed time to rebuild what had been damaged. Warren's private doctor said he needed to rest for at least 2 weeks. Conrad rested for exactly 6 hours. The next morning, when Kira brought water and medicine into the room, she found Conrad already sitting up, his back against the headboard, a phone in his hand. He was speaking to someone, his voice low and even, and every sentence he said was shorter than the one before. Kira set the tray down on the bedside table and was about to leave when she heard Conrad say into the phone, "Call everyone back to the mansion, this afternoon. Anyone who doesn't come, I'll take it as choosing a side." He ended the call, looked at Kira for 1 second, then looked away. He said nothing. Kira left the room. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there were 11 men seated around the long table in the large meeting room on the first floor of the mansion. These were the highest-ranking remaining contacts in the Ashford organization, the men who controlled everything from finance and real estate to transportation and underground casinos. Some came as soon as they were called. Some hesitated, arrived late, and sat farther from the table. All of them had heard that Conrad was dead, and none of them understood why they were now sitting in front of a man who should have been lying in the cold cellar. Conrad entered the meeting room, with Warren walking beside him but not supporting him. Conrad walked on his own. Each step was slower than usual, but straight. He sat down at the head of the table. No greeting, no explanation, no story about how he had almost died. He began to speak, his voice deep, clear, each sentence falling into the room like stones dropping onto the surface of a still lake. While I was in the hospital, some of the people in this room changed sides. I know who. I know how much. I know which channels the transactions went through. He stopped and looked around the table slowly, one man at a time. The two men sitting farthest from the table lowered their faces. I'm not asking why. I don't need to hear your reasons. I'm saying this only once. From this moment on, every financial channel Garrett opened to the outside is cut off. Garrett's assets are frozen. Warren will send each of you a list of accounts that must be closed before tomorrow morning. He looked down at the table, then added, his voice no louder than before but noticeably heavier. As for those who change sides, I'm giving you 24 hours to come back. Whoever doesn't come back won't need to ask me a second time. No one in the room said a word. 11 men, many older than Conrad, many bigger than him, many who had been in the organization longer than he had, and yet not one of them dared to look directly into his eyes. Kira stood outside the meeting room door, leaving it open just enough to hear. She watched Conrad sitting at the head of the table, his back straight, even though he was surely in pain, his face expressionless, his voice not trembling at all, and everyone in that room feared him. She realized this was the first time she had seen the real Conrad Ashford, not the unconscious patient on a hospital bed, not the trembling man in the cold cellar, but the boss, the man who controlled an entire empire with his voice and his eyes. When the meeting ended, everyone left one by one. Kira waited until the room was empty, then stepped inside, carrying a tray of food. She set it down on the table beside Conrad. He didn't look up, his eyes still fixed on the folder in front of him. Then he said, his voice flat, "You saw all of it?" Kira answered, "Yes." Conrad looked up at her. "Are you afraid?" Kira looked back at him without blinking. "I've been afraid of many things, but not you." Conrad looked at her for a few more seconds. It wasn't the look of someone judging or doubting her. It was the look of someone who didn't understand. He was used to people fearing him. That was how his world worked. But this girl, this night shift nurse, who had gone down into the cold cellar to save him, had just watched him make an entire room tremble with his orders, and she stood here saying, "Not you," with a calm face, as if she were talking about the weather. That was the first moment Kira Donovan made Conrad Ashford curious. The next day, one of the senior contacts who had followed Garrett while Conrad was in a coma came asking to meet him. This man had managed transportation for the organization for more than 10 years. He stepped into Conrad's office with his head lowered and his shoulders slumped. He said he had been forced, said he had no choice, said he was asking for one chance. Conrad listened until the man finished, silent. Then he answered, his voice neither angry nor merciful. "Go. Leave Chicago. I'm giving you this chance once." The man looked up, his eyes both relieved and afraid, then backed out of the room. Conrad turned back to the documents in front of him, as if the conversation had never happened. Garrett Ashford lay in a holding room in the basement of the mansion, the door locked, 2 men standing guard outside. He couldn't go anywhere. But the most dangerous thing about Garrett had never been his fists or a gun. It was his mind, and that mind had already acted before he was captured. During the days when Conrad was comatose, when Garrett believed his plan would succeed, he had prepared a layer of insurance. He ordered Dr. Paxton Mercer to spread a piece of information inside the organization. Conrad Ashford was the one who had ordered their father killed years ago in order to steal the succession. Paxton sent encrypted messages to 7 middle-tier contacts in the organization, along with fake evidence, carefully fabricated documents about unusual financial transactions around the time the Ashford father died. The rumor spread slowly but surely. While Conrad was meeting with the 11 senior contacts upstairs, downstairs, in the kitchen, in the hallways, among the lower-ranking men, the story that Conrad killed his father had already begun to be whispered. At first, it was only suspicion. Then it became a question. Then it became a reason for some people to hesitate when Conrad ordered them to return within 24 hours. Not because they were loyal to Garrett, but because they weren't sure Conrad deserved their loyalty. 3 days after the meeting, Warren realized there was a problem. Fewer people returned than expected. Some middle-tier contacts didn't answer their phones. Some financial transactions weren't carried out according to the new orders. Something was eating away at the organization from the inside. And it wasn't fear. It was doubt. Kira was the first one to hear it. Not from a meeting or a report. From the mansion kitchen. She was still staying at the mansion at Warren's request because her rented room was no longer safe. She had nothing to do except help with meals and care for Conrad when the doctor wasn't present. On the morning of the 4th day, Kira was making coffee in the kitchen when she heard 2 men talking in the hallway outside. They didn't know she was there. One man said, "Did you hear the story about Old Man Ashford? People are saying it was Conrad who..." The other cut him off. "Shut up. Don't say it here." They walked away. Kira set the coffee cup down. She didn't ignore it. She never ignored things. She began to listen, to observe, and to ask. Not directly, but in the way someone no one paid attention to could ask. She talked to the cook, to the drivers, to the housekeepers. She asked about families, about work, and between ordinary conversations, she pieced together a picture. Someone had spread the claim that Conrad killed his father, and that rumor had begun to circulate about a week earlier, exactly when Conrad was still in a coma. Kira knew when the rumor started, which meant she could find out who started it. She asked Warren to let her see Garrett's phone, which had been confiscated when he was captured. Warren hesitated, but agreed. Kira didn't understand encryption. She didn't know high technology, but she knew how to read. She sat for 2 hours, scrolling through hundreds of messages on Garrett's phone, and she found what she needed. A message thread between Garrett and Paxton Mercer, sent 6 days earlier, 2 days after Conrad was admitted to the hospital. The content was clear. Garrett instructed Paxton to create fake evidence documents about the death of the Ashford father, along with a list of 7 people who needed to receive them and the exact timing for spreading the information. Kira photographed the entire thread and brought it to Conrad's room. He was sitting there reading documents, his face tired but his eyes still sharp. Kira set Garrett's phone on the table, opened the exact message thread, and said, "Garrett spread the rumor that you killed your father. This is the proof. It was sent through Paxton Mercer to 7 people in the organization 6 days ago. That's why some people haven't come back." Conrad looked at the phone screen. He read every message. His face didn't change, but his left hand on the table slowly tightened into a fist, then released. He looked up at Kira, silent for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't just save my life. You saved the organization too." Kira answered in a voice as ordinary as if she were talking about a normal hospital shift. "I didn't save the organization. I just don't like people lying." Conrad looked at her a while longer, and in his eyes at that moment, there was something different. Not curiosity like before. This time, it looked like respect. Warren contacted Madame Genevieve that same afternoon. She came to the mansion that evening and called an internal meeting with the contacts who were still wavering. Kira didn't attend the meeting, but Warren told her about it afterward. Madame Genevieve placed the evidence Kira had found on the table and let everyone read it for themselves. Then she spoke, her voice low and slow, each word carrying the weight of nearly 40 years standing at the head of the family. "My son, Conrad and Garrett's father, did not die because of Conrad. The decision about their father was mine. I made that decision because he was destroying everything I had built. Anyone who wants to doubt Conrad should doubt me first." No one in the room said another word. The meeting ended in 15 minutes. The wavering men returned. The financial channels were restored. The organization stabilized again, not because Conrad gave an order, but because Genevieve Ashford had spoken. And the reason she could speak was because a night shift nurse had spent 2 hours reading messages on a trader's phone. After the internal meeting, when the last of the contacts had left the mansion, Genevieve Ashford didn't go home right away. She walked along the first-floor hallway, her steps slow but straight, a cane in her hand, though it barely touched the floor, as if she carried it out of habit rather than need. She stopped at the kitchen doorway, where Kira was washing coffee cups. Kira turned, saw her standing there, and for the first time, the 2 women looked at each other with no one else around. Genevieve stepped inside and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. She looked Kira over from head to toe, slowly, thoroughly. with the gaze of someone who had lived nearly 80 years and no longer needed politeness in order to judge a person. Then she said, her voice flat, "My grandson is in love with a nurse?" Kira set the coffee cup down in the sink, wiped her hands on a towel, then turned back and looked straight into the old woman's eyes. "Your grandson is still alive for you to sit here and say that because of this nurse." Silence. Genevieve looked at Kira without blinking for 3 seconds. Then she laughed. Not loudly, just the corner of her mouth lifting, and her eyes brightening a little. She said, "The last person who dared say something straight to my face was Conrad's mother. She stood in this very kitchen too, looking at me exactly the way you're looking at me now." Kira didn't answer. She knew nothing about Conrad's mother, and she didn't want to ask about things that weren't hers to claim. Genevieve stood, leaned on her cane, and walked toward the door. But before stepping out, she stopped without turning around and said, "Don't leave him. He'll push you away because he's afraid. Don't let him do that." Then she left. The light tap of her cane faded across the wooden floor. Kira stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the door Genevieve had just passed through, wondering why those words sounded more like a warning than advice. She would understand in less than 2 days. Conrad recovered faster than expected. By the 7th day after the night in the cold cellar, he was walking normally, dressing himself, and going downstairs to make coffee at 5 o'clock in the morning. His body was recovering, but his mind was moving in another direction. He began to realize something he hadn't thought about while lying in bed. Kira was still here. She was in his mansion, moving among his people, hearing conversations not meant for outsiders, and she knew too much. But what worried Conrad wasn't that she knew too much. It was that he was starting to want her to stay. And in Conrad Ashford's world, wanting someone to stay beside him meant putting that person in danger. His mother had died because of that. She died when Conrad was still a child, because of the dangers inside the life of that family, dangers she had no way to escape. Conrad remembered. He always remembered, and he told himself he would never let that happen again. That evening, Conrad called Kira into his office. He stood beside the window, his back turned to her. When she walked in, he didn't turn around right away. He said, his voice flat, as if speaking about a business decision, "You should leave. You don't belong in this world. I've repaid you enough. Warren will arrange a new place for you, a new job, in another city if you want." Kira stood in the middle of the room, looking at his back turned toward her. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She understood exactly what was happening. She saw the fear in the way he didn't dare turn and face her while saying those words. Genevieve had been right, she answered, her voice clear. "You don't get to decide where I belong. I survived 27 years without anyone's permission." Then she turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind her. She didn't wait for him to answer. Conrad stood there, staring at the closed door, his face expressionless. Then he slammed his hand down on the wooden desk, hard. Once, the coffee cup on the table jumped, and liquid spilled over the rim. It was the only time in this entire story that Conrad Ashford lost control. Warren was standing in the hallway. Hearing the strike against the table, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. He looked at Conrad, looked at the spilled coffee, looked at the door Kira had just walked through. He said, "You're driving away the only person who's truly on your side." Conrad didn't answer. Warren continued, his voice softer but heavier. "Your mother didn't die because she loved your father. Your mother died because of your father's enemies. Kira isn't your mother, and you're not your father." Conrad still didn't answer, but Warren knew the words had landed where they needed to, because Conrad didn't throw him out. Kira left the mansion that afternoon. She returned to Lakewood Medical and asked to take back her night shifts. The shift manager was surprised because she had been gone nearly a week without notice, but the hospital was short-staffed, so they accepted her immediately. Kira worked her first night shift, cared for patients, filled out charts, moved along the familiar hallways, and tried not to think about the mansion beside Lake Michigan. But when she left the hospital at 7 o'clock in the morning, she noticed a black car parked across the street. The same kind of car she had seen in Genevieve's convoy on the night they stormed the mansion. She looked at the car, then took out her phone and called Conrad's number. He answered after 2 rings. "Did you send someone to follow me?" A brief silence. Then Conrad's voice, deep and quiet. "You wouldn't let me protect you directly. This is the only way I can sleep." Kira looked at the black car and stayed silent for a moment. Then she said, "Fine, but tell them not to stand right outside the emergency room doors. The patients get scared." On the other end of the line, inside the mansion beside Lake Michigan, Conrad Ashford smiled. For the first time since he had awakened in the cold cellar, 4 days after Kira left the mansion, Conrad Ashford drove to Lakewood Medical at 2:45 in the morning. He came alone, without guards, without telling Warren. He parked in the rear lot of the hospital, entered through the staff door whose location he had learned while Kira was still staying at the mansion, and walked down the ground floor hallway toward the night shift nurse's station. He didn't go inside. He leaned back against the corridor wall, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, and waited. He stood there for 15 minutes. The hospital hallway at 3 o'clock in the morning was almost empty, with only the white glare of fluorescent lights and the steady hum of the air conditioning. A patient passed by, looked at him, then kept walking. A hospital guard on patrol saw him and was about to ask a question, but after looking more closely at Conrad's face, he decided not to ask and walked away. As her night shift finally ended, the door to the nurse's station opened. Kira stepped out, holding her handbag, her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her face tired after a long shift. She turned right, about to head toward the stairs, and saw Conrad standing against the wall 5 meters away. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Kira asked, her voice as ordinary as if she were asking about the weather. "What are you doing here?" Conrad pushed himself away from the wall and stood straight. He didn't step closer, keeping the distance between them, as if he knew he had no right to come any nearer after what he had said. Then he spoke, his voice low and slow, every word clear. "I was wrong. I pushed you away because I was afraid. I've never been afraid of anyone. I'm not afraid of Garrett, not afraid of rival organizations, not afraid of the police, not afraid of death. But I'm afraid of losing you. I don't know how to love someone without being afraid of losing them, but I know I don't want you to go." No flowers, no ring, no kneeling, only a Mafia boss standing in a hospital hallway at 3 o'clock in the morning, pale from lack of sleep, his eyes fixed on the night shift nurse, and telling the truth. Kira looked at him for a long time. She saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, not even in the cold cellar, not even when he faced Garrett. She saw truth with no layer of armor wrapped around it. She said, "I don't promise it'll be safe. I don't promise it'll be easy, but I promise I won't leave just because you tell me to leave." Conrad stepped toward her, slowly. He reached out and took her hand. His hand, the same hand that had made an entire meeting room of 11 men tremble, now held hers gently, carefully, as if he were holding something precious and was afraid of breaking it. Kira didn't pull away. They walked out of the hospital under the pale Chicago dawn, hand in hand, without saying another word. Kira moved into the mansion beside Lake Michigan, but she didn't quit her job. She still worked the night shift at Lakewood Medical, still wore her white uniform, still pushed the medication cart along the hallway at midnight. Conrad didn't object. He understood that nursing wasn't something Kira did just to earn a living. It was part of who she was, and he would never touch that part of her. Every night, Kira worked a shift. Conrad waited in the mansion kitchen. He was the earliest riser in the organization, but now he stayed up the latest. When Kira came home after her duty, he already had coffee made and a plate of bread waiting on the kitchen table. They sat together for a late meal in the quiet kitchen, talking about ordinary things, about her night shift patients, about the weather over Lake Michigan, about the book Kira was still reading. Some nights, they said nothing at all, only sat beside each other on the balcony, looking out at the dark lake, listening to the water strike the shore, and the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was warm. One night, when neither of them could sleep, they sat on the balcony, and Conrad told her about his mother. He didn't tell a long story, only a few sentences, his voice low, his eyes on the lake. His mother had been a servant in his father's house. His father loved her but never married her. She died when Conrad was still small because of the dangers inside that family's life. He said, "I learned one thing from the day my mother died. To love someone is to put them in danger. So I didn't love anyone. For more than 20 years, that rule kept me alive." He paused. "Until you came down into the cold cellar." Kira listened, without interrupting, without asking more. When Conrad finished, she stayed silent for a while, then said softly, "I know what it feels like to lose someone important. The difference is, I've never had anyone to lose." One sentence. shorter than any story, but heavier than all of them. Conrad didn't answer with words. He drew her gently against his shoulder and let her lean on him. Kira didn't resist. For the first time in 27 years, she allowed herself to be weak in front of another person. And that person, ironically, was the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. 2 weeks passed. Life in the mansion beside Lake Michigan began to find its own rhythm. A strange rhythm between the underworld and late-night meals in the kitchen, between Conrad's cold phone calls during the day and the nights when he sat on the balcony waiting for Kira to come home. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction, but Kira knew something wasn't right with her body. First came the dizziness. Not the kind of dizziness that came from lack of sleep. She was used to that feeling after years of working night shifts. This was different. The sensation of the room suddenly tilting, then returning to normal, followed by a faint nausea every morning. Then came the exhaustion. Not exhaustion from working too much, but the kind that sank deep into the bones, the kind that made the body feel heavy as stone even after enough sleep. Kira was a nurse. She recognized the symptoms before anyone else did, before Conrad had time to notice that she was paler than usual, before Warren had time to ask why she was eating less. She knew her body was trying to tell her something, and she didn't ignore it. She went by herself for testing at a small clinic in Chinatown, where no one knew her name and no one could connect her to the Ashford mansion. She registered under a false name, paid in cash, and sat waiting for the results for 2 days. When the results came back, Kira sat on a plastic chair in the empty waiting room, holding the printed paper in her hand, and read each line. Advanced kidney failure. Filtration function in both kidneys had declined severely. Cause: accumulated damage from years of malnutrition and exhaustion after being forced to live independently too early, compounded by the long-term physical burden of night shift work. Recommendation: kidney transplant. Waiting list for a compatible donor. Unknown timeframe. Kira folded the paper and put it into her handbag. She didn't cry. She looked through the glass door of the clinic, watched people moving along the street, and received the bad news alone. This wasn't the first time. She had received bad news alone for 27 years. Every move to another foster family had been bad news. Every rejection had been bad news. She was used to it. She stood, walked out of the clinic, and took the subway to the hospital for her shift as usual. She decided not to tell Conrad. He was still in the middle of stabilizing the organization, with financial channels still needing to be handled, contacts needing to be rearranged, and outside threats still needing to be guarded against. She didn't want to become a burden. She didn't want him to divide his focus for the failing body of a night shift nurse. She hid the medicine in the locked compartment of her handbag. She took it in the hospital changing room before each shift. She still cooked, still made coffee, still sat with Conrad on the balcony every night. He didn't know. 2 weeks passed. One night, Kira came home after her shift at 4 o'clock in the morning. Conrad was waiting in the kitchen as usual, coffee already made, a plate of bread on the table. Kira walked into the kitchen, gave him a faint smile, set her handbag down on a chair, then reached for the coffee cup on the counter. And she fell. There was no warning, no time to grab onto anything. Her knees buckled, her eyes widened, and her body pitched forward. Conrad saw it. He had been sitting 3 steps away, but he moved faster than he had at any moment since waking in the cold cellar. He caught her before her head struck the stone floor, one arm around her back, one hand supporting her head. Her handbag fell to the floor, the clasp springing open. A bottle of medicine rolled across the kitchen tiles, with a white plastic cap and tiny printed letters on the label. Conrad held Kira in his arms, his eyes dropping to the bottle. He read the label, read the name of the medication, the name of the active ingredient. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew how to read. And he understood. Kira regained consciousness after a few seconds, opened her eyes, and found herself lying in Conrad's arms on the kitchen floor. She saw the bottle of medicine beside them, and she knew he had seen it. His eyes looked at her, red, though his face was still trying to remain calm. He asked, his voice low, "Why didn't you tell me?" Kira answered, her voice weak but clear, "Because you have an entire empire to hold together. You think that empire matters more than you?" "I think I'm used to taking care of myself." Conrad looked at her. The hand holding her back tightened a little, then loosened again. "Gentle," he said, his voice very soft, softer than she had ever heard it. "You don't have to be used to that anymore." The next morning, Conrad didn't ask Kira another question. He called Warren's private doctor and demanded that a complete examination be arranged for Kira at the best hospital in Chicago within 24 hours. Kira objected. She said she had already gone to a doctor. She knew the results, and there was no need to spend more money. Conrad looked at her and said nothing, only looked. Then he said one single sentence. "Go to the appointment. For me." Kira went. The results from Northwestern Memorial Hospital confirmed completely what the small clinic in Chinatown had already said. Advanced kidney failure on both sides. Filtration function had dropped below 20%. She needed a kidney transplant. The doctor explained that the waiting list for a compatible donor could take months, even years. And at the current rate of decline, Kira didn't have years. Conrad sat in the waiting room while the doctor spoke with Kira. He didn't go into the room with her, because she didn't want him to. But when she stepped out, her face calm, her voice calm, and said, "The results are the same as last time. Nothing new." Conrad knew she was hiding. Not the results, but the fear. That afternoon, Conrad returned to Northwestern Memorial alone, without telling anyone. He met the doctor in charge of Kira's case and requested blood tests to check whether he was compatible as a kidney donor. The doctor looked at him and asked whether he understood the risks. Conrad answered, "I understand. Do it." The results came back 48 hours later. Conrad Ashford was compatible to donate a kidney to Kira Donovan. He sat in the car, read the results on his phone, then called the doctor. Arranged the surgery as soon as possible. He didn't tell Kira. He called Warren. Warren came to the mansion that very afternoon, his face more serious than Kira had ever seen it. The two men talked inside the office behind closed doors for nearly an hour. Kira passed by and heard Warren's voice louder than usual, something that almost never happened. "You're the head of the organization. You can't be lying on an operating table right now. Garrett is still locked in the basement. The organization has only just stabilized, and there are still enemies waiting outside. If anyone knows you're weak, knows you're in the hospital, they'll act immediately." Silence. Then Conrad's voice, low and clear, every word unwavering. "If she dies, what meaning does this organization have?" Warren didn't answer. Kira stood outside the door, her hand against the wall, and she heard Warren's silence. The silence of a man who had just lost an argument. Not because he had run out of reasons, but because he understood that no reason could defeat what had just been said. 5 days later, Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Kira lay on a hospital bed, wearing a surgical gown, her arm connected to an IV line. She had been told that a compatible donor had been found, that the surgery had been arranged, that everything was ready, but no one told her who the donor was. She asked the doctor. The doctor said it was confidential information at the donor's request. She asked Warren. Warren avoided her eyes and said, "You'll know soon." The operating room had 2 beds prepared, separated by a curtain. Kira lay on the bed on the left, staring up at the ceiling, her heart racing with anxiety. She heard the sound of a rolling bed on the right, nurses talking, the sound of monitors being connected. Then the curtain was pulled aside, and Kira saw Conrad Ashford lying on the bed beside her, also wearing a surgical gown, also connected to an IV line, also being prepared for surgery. His eyes were on her. Kira looked back at him, not understanding, then understanding. She turned to the nurse, checking the equipment beside her bed. "Who's the kidney donor?" The nurse looked toward the bed beside her, then back at Kira. "Mr. Ashford." Kira turned back to Conrad. Her eyes reddened, not slowly, but instantly, as if everything she had held back for 27 years had risen all at once. She said, her voice trembling, "You're insane." Conrad looked at her, his face calm, but his eyes were not calm. In his eyes was something Kira had never seen from anyone who looked at her, an absolute certainty that this decision was right. He said, "You saved my life when I was a stranger. I owe you more than one kidney." Kira cried. Tears ran down her cheeks, falling onto the white pillow, and she didn't wipe them away. This was the first time in this entire story that Kira Donovan cried, not because of pain, not because of fear, but because for 27 years, she had lived in a world where no one had chosen to sacrifice for her. No one had chosen her, no foster family, no friends, no one. And now the man lying on the bed beside her, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man half the city feared, was preparing to cut out a part of his own body to keep her alive, not because he owed her, but because he chose her. Conrad reached his hand across the space between the two beds. Kira took it. He squeezed gently. He said, "When you wake up, I'll be here. You're not alone anymore." The nurse injected the anesthetic into the IV line. Kira felt her eyes grow heavy, and the room blurred, but her hand didn't let go of Conrad's, and the last thing she felt before sinking into sleep was his hand still holding hers, steady, warm, and not letting go. The surgery was successful. Both of them woke up in the recovery room, in bed side by side, exactly as Conrad had promised. Kira opened her eyes, turned her head, and saw him looking at her, his face pale but his eyes awake. He whispered, "I'm here." 4 weeks of recovery in the hospital followed. Then they returned to the mansion. Kira rested for 4 more weeks, then went back to Lakewood Medical for her night shifts. Conrad didn't object. He had learned that stopping Kira from doing what she wanted was useless. He hadn't fully recovered, and the incision still hurt when he bent down or stood too long, but he returned to running the organization from his office inside the mansion. Warren stayed beside him, handling the things Conrad couldn't handle directly. Everything slowly settled. But there was one thing Conrad, Warren, and Kira didn't know. Beneath the mansion, in Garrett Ashford's holding room, the dark gears he had set in motion before his capture were still turning in secret, waiting for the right moment to take root. Dr. Paxton Mercer, the man who had signed Conrad's false brain death declaration, hadn't been captured at the same time as Garrett. In the chaos of the night, they stormed the mansion. Paxton had escaped. Warren sent people to find him, but he vanished from Chicago as if he had never existed. Everyone thought he had run away. They were wrong. Paxton hadn't run. Paxton was waiting. He contacted Alistair Crane, the boss of the rival organization that controlled South Chicago. Alistair had lost territory and financial channels to Conrad after Conrad reclaimed power, and he wanted revenge. Garrett was the perfect card to play. Paxton was the bridge. The plan was simple. Paxton still had access to the mansion through a side tunnel he knew from his time as the family doctor. An old tunnel from the days when the Ashford father had built the mansion, one Conrad didn't know about because it had been sealed before he inherited the estate. Paxton opened the tunnel from the outside, entered the mansion in the middle of the night, and drugged the 2 men guarding Garrett's cell. Garrett woke up, saw the door open, saw Paxton standing there with car keys and the address of a hideout provided by Alistair Crane. He didn't ask a single question. He walked out. The next morning, when the shift replacement found the 2 guards unconscious and the holding room empty, Warren called Conrad immediately. Conrad heard the news, stayed silent for 5 seconds, then said, "Increase security around Kira. Double it, right now." He knew. He knew Garrett wouldn't aim at him. Aiming at him meant facing the entire organization directly, and Garrett didn't have the strength for that. But Garrett knew Conrad's weakness. All of Chicago knew it now. That weakness was named Kira Donovan, but Conrad was 12 hours behind Garrett. Garrett had acted from the night he escaped. He didn't wait, didn't form a long-term plan, didn't observe. He acted at once, because he knew every passing hour gave Conrad 1 more hour to respond. The night Garrett escaped, Kira was working her shift at Lakewood Medical. 1 o'clock in the morning, the VIP floor hallway was empty. 2 of Conrad's guards stood at the hospital entrance and outside the area where Kira worked. They didn't see the small truck parked in the rear lot, where the medical receiving door opened every night to accept medicine and equipment from suppliers. 3 of Alistair's men entered the hospital through that door, wearing medical delivery uniforms. They went straight up to the VIP floor by the freight elevator. Conrad's 2 guards were neutralized before they could react, quickly and silently, and no one in the hospital heard anything. Kira was checking patient records in the nurse's station when the door opened. She looked up, saw 3 men in delivery uniforms, and the instinct she had developed after living long enough in the Ashford world made her understand immediately. She stood up and stepped back, but she wasn't fast enough. They restrained her, quickly and firmly, then took her out of the hospital through the same receiving door they had entered. Kira was brought to an abandoned industrial warehouse on the western outskirts of Chicago, 40 minutes by car from the city center. The warehouse was wide and empty, with a high ceiling and old industrial lights flickering overhead, casting alternating patches of brightness and darkness across the cracked concrete floor. Garrett stood there, waiting for her. He looked different from the last time Kira had seen him in the mansion living room. Thinner, his eyes more sunken, but his gaze sharper, the kind of sharpness that belonged to a man with nothing left to lose. He looked at Kira, nodded to the three men, then took out his phone. He called Conrad. 4 o'clock in the morning, Conrad was sitting in the mansion office, having just received word that the 2 guards at the hospital had lost contact. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered. Garrett's voice came through, calm and slow. The voice Conrad had heard throughout all 33 years of his life. The voice of his half-brother, now cold as steel. Conrad, I have your nurse. Come to the old warehouse in the Western Industrial District. You know the place. Come alone. Bring the transfer papers for the entire Ashford organization. Her life in exchange. Silence. Then Garrett added, softly enough to be cruel. You have 2 hours. After 2 hours, I won't wait anymore. The line went dead. Conrad set the phone down on the table. His hands didn't shake. His face didn't change color. But his eyes, those eyes that were usually cold and controlled, now burned with something Warren, standing right beside him, had never seen in all the 30 years he had known Conrad. It wasn't anger. It was deeper than anger. Conrad knew Garrett wasn't bluffing. He had killed Conrad once. He wouldn't hesitate a second time. And this time, the target was the person Conrad had cut out a part of his own body to keep alive. Warren spoke the moment Conrad set the phone down. I'll send people. You stay here. Conrad rose from the chair. The incision along his right side flared with pain, and Warren knew it because a muscle in Conrad's face twitched for a fraction of a second. But he didn't sit back down. He said, his voice even, not 1 decibel louder than usual, Garrett wants me. He won't talk to anyone else, and he'll hurt her if I don't come. Warren looked at him. He knew that expression. He had seen it only once before, on Conrad's mother's face, a very long time ago, and he knew there were no words in this world that could change the decision behind that expression. He said nothing more. He took the car keys. Conrad didn't rush. That was what made Warren both respect him and fear him. An ordinary man, after learning that the woman he loved was being held, would have run for the door, would have shouted, would have lost control. Conrad Ashford did none of those things. He stood in the middle of the office, closed his eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them. And when his eyes opened, everything personal had been pushed down into some very deep place. What remained was the boss, cold, precise, and extremely dangerous. He took out his phone and made the first call. This is Conrad, the old warehouse in the Western Industrial District, on Cicero Avenue. I need 8 men around the outer perimeter within 30 minutes. No one goes in until I give the order. The second call. Cut power to the entire area within a 300-meter radius of the warehouse. Exactly at 4:45. Not early, not late. The third call. Block the south and east exits. Any vehicle leaving the area gets stopped. No exceptions. Each call lasted no more than 30 seconds. His voice was deep, clear, and he didn't repeat any order twice. He didn't ask whether anyone was ready, didn't explain why, didn't say Kira's name. He gave orders, and every order was received with a single yes from the other end of the line. Warren stood watching, and he realized something many people didn't understand about Conrad Ashford. He was most frightening not when he was angry, but when he was calm. This calm didn't exist because he wasn't afraid. It existed because he had pushed the fear down, locked it away, and turned it into fuel for every decision he would make over the next 15 minutes. Conrad put on his coat and walked out of the mansion. The Chicago night was pitch black, and the wind from Lake Michigan blew cold against his face. He went straight to the car and opened the driver's door. Warren followed quickly and got into the passenger seat. Conrad drove. The incision hurt every time he pressed the gas pedal or turned the wheel sharply, but his face didn't change. He drove fast, precise, cutting through the empty streets of Chicago at 4 o'clock in the morning with the skill of a man who had known every corner of this city since he was a boy, following his father everywhere. Warren sat beside him, looking at Conrad. His face was pale beneath the streetlights, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead without blinking. The incision hadn't fully healed. The doctor had said no strenuous movement for 3 months. It had only been 8 weeks. But Conrad drove through the Chicago night as if his body didn't exist, as if pain were only background noise he had already turned off. Warren said, softly, almost in a whisper, "You're like your mother. She never let anyone touch the people she loved either." Conrad didn't answer. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The car turned into the Western Industrial District, where the streetlights grew sparse, the houses disappeared, and gray warehouses and empty lots took their place. 4:35 in the morning. 10 minutes before the power would be cut. Conrad parked the car 200 meters from the warehouse, turned off the headlights, then killed the engine. In the dark, he could see the warehouse ahead, faint yellow light spilling through the cracks around the door. Kira was inside. He looked at his watch. Then he opened the car door and stepped out. The night was cold. The incision throbbed. He drew in a long breath, then walked toward the warehouse, his back straight, his steps even. Not fast, not slow. He didn't come like a desperate man begging his brother to spare the woman he loved. He came like the boss of the Ashford Empire, walking in to take back what belonged to him. Inside the warehouse, Kira sat on an iron chair in the middle of the cracked concrete floor. Her hands were bound behind her with plastic ties, tight enough that she couldn't escape, but not tight enough to make her hands go numb. She noticed that the people holding her weren't professionals. They were hired muscle from outside, not men from the Ashford organization. She remembered it. The industrial lights on the ceiling flickered, alternating between light and darkness, throwing wide patches of shadow along the edges of the warehouse. 3 men stood scattered around the space, one near the main door, one near the rear side door, and one a few meters from Kira, arms crossed over his chest. Garrett sat on a wooden crate across from her, one leg crossed over the other, his face calm. But that calm was much thinner and more fragile than the last time she had seen him in the mansion living room. Kira didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked straight at Garrett and talked. She knew every minute she stretched out was another minute for Conrad and Warren to act. She also knew that keeping Garrett talking was the best way to keep him from doing anything else. Garrett liked to talk. He liked being listened to. That was his deepest wound, a lifetime of speaking while no one truly heard him. "Do you know what your biggest mistake was?" Garrett asked, his voice gentle, almost friendly. "Saving my brother." Kira looked at him, then answered calmly, "No, the biggest mistake was yours. You thought power belongs to the person who deserves it most, but power belongs to the person willing to carry it." Garrett went silent. His eyes narrowed, not because he was angry, but because the words had touched the exact place he didn't want anyone to touch. While they talked, Kira observed. She watched the 3 men around her, memorizing their positions, their distances, their habits. The man near the main door kept checking his phone. The man near the side door yawned often, tired, and the man standing closest to her, tall and broad-shouldered, had one detail Kira recognized immediately with a nurse's eye. Every 15 minutes, he pulled a small medicine tube from his pocket and inhaled from it, EpiPen. Allergy medication in inhaler form. He had a severe allergy and needed medication constantly. Kira remembered that, and she began looking for something else. Her eyes swept the concrete floor around the chair. It was an old warehouse, the floor cracked, industrial debris scattered everywhere. She saw a thin piece of metal, maybe from a can or an old machine part, lying under the left leg of the chair. She used her foot to pull the piece of metal gently toward herself, then bent just enough for her hands behind her back to reach it and hide it in her palm. No one noticed. 4:45. The warehouse lights went out. Complete darkness. Garrett shouted, "What is this?" One of the 3 men pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The small beam swept across the warehouse. Then came footsteps at the main door. A shadow stepped inside. Conrad Ashford stood in the doorway, the weak light from outside outlining his shape. He walked into the warehouse slowly, back straight, empty-handed. No papers, no bag, no army behind him. Alone. Exactly as Garrett had demanded. Garrett looked at his younger brother, then looked around, searching for any sign of someone else. There was no one. He smiled, the smile of a man who thought he had won. "You really came alone," Conrad answered, his voice low. "Let her go. This is between you and me. Where are the transfer papers?" Conrad looked at Garrett, then at Kira. His eyes stopped on her for 1 second, checking, confirming that she was still whole. Then he looked back at Garrett. "I didn't bring papers. I brought you your last choice. Walk away, or never walk again." Garrett laughed, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're bluffing. You came alone, brought nothing, and you think you can threaten." The lights came back on, not the warehouse lights, headlights from outside, pouring through every crack in the door, every broken window. At the same time, the rear side door opened. The side entrance was pushed in, and footsteps came from every direction. Conrad's team flooded into the warehouse from 3 entrances at once, fast, silent, overwhelming. Garrett's 3 men were neutralized within seconds. The man near the main door was pinned in place. The man near the side door was blocked when he tried to run, and the man standing closest to Kira, the one with the EpiPen, turned toward her as the chaos erupted, intending to use her as a hostage. But Kira was ready. When he stepped toward her, she kicked hard at his leg. He lost his balance, and the EpiPen fell from his pocket and rolled across the floor. He turned to look for the medicine. Survival instinct stronger than fighting instinct, and in the 3 seconds he bent to pick it up, Kira put all her strength into snapping the plastic ties, which she had already weakened with the metal shard, while talking to Garrett. She stood, stepped away from the chair, free. When Conrad ran to her, Kira was already standing, her right hand still holding the piece of metal, the severed plastic ties lying on the floor at her feet. She looked at him, breathing hard, but her eyes bright. "I'm okay." Conrad looked at her, looked at the metal shard, looked at the cut plastic ties. He understood. She had nearly escaped before he arrived. He hadn't saved a victim. He had come to support someone who was already fighting for herself. Garrett was held tightly by 2 of Conrad's men in the middle of the warehouse. He didn't resist. He looked at Conrad and Kira standing side by side, and on his face was the emptiness of a man who knew everything was over. Then the main door opened again. The sound of a cane touched the concrete floor, slow and steady. Genevieve Ashford stepped into the warehouse, 78 years old, her back straight, her eyes bright in the glare of the headlights. She had arrived with Conrad's team but had stayed outside until now. She walked straight to Garrett and stood before her grandson, looking down at him. Garrett looked up at her, and for the first time, Kira saw something in Garrett's eyes that wasn't anger or hatred. It was longing, the longing of a child who wanted his grandmother to recognize him. Genevieve spoke, her voice low and slow, every word clear. "You're like your father. You think power is a reward, but power is a burden. You don't have the strength to carry it." Garrett looked at her, his mouth opened, as if he meant to say something, but no words came out. Then his shoulders collapsed, his head lowered. Not because he had been captured, not because he had lost, but because the last person in the world whose recognition he wanted had looked him straight in the eye and told him he wasn't enough. That was what destroyed Garrett Ashford completely. Not prison, not failure, but his grandmother's rejection. Garrett was loaded into a car, along with the 3 hired men, and taken back to the mansion under Genevieve's escort. This time, there would be no holding room in the basement. This time, Warren had already prepared another arrangement, tighter, more secure, with no way out. But before the convoy left the industrial district, Warren's phone rang. He answered, his face changed, and then he turned to Conrad. "Paxton Mercer. Our people found him at a motel outside Milwaukee, 2 hours north of Chicago by car. He didn't run any farther. He's there, waiting." Warren paused, then added, "And he has everything with him. Conrad's falsified medical records, the death declaration Paxton signed, every financial transaction between Garrett and Alistair Crane, the messages ordering the fake rumor to be spread, enough to destroy the entire Ashford organization if it goes to the FBI." Conrad stood beside the car, Kira beside him. The night was still dark, and cold wind blew through the abandoned industrial district from the west. He asked, his voice flat, "Why did he bring it with him? He should have destroyed it." Warren shook his head. "He isn't stupid. He kept the evidence as life insurance. He knows both Garrett and you want to deal with him. That evidence is the only thing keeping him alive. If he's dealt with, the evidence will automatically be sent to the FBI through a timed system he already set up." Conrad looked at Warren. "Send people. Deal with him before sunrise." It was the natural reaction. The reaction of a Mafia boss who had operated the same way for 8 years. Fast, decisive, absolute. But before Warren could nod, Kira said, "No." Both Conrad and Warren looked at her. Kira stood there, the piece of metal still in her pocket, the cut plastic tie marks still on her wrists. Her face tired but her eyes clear. She said, her voice steady. Not the voice of someone pleading, but the voice of someone analyzing the situation. "He didn't run. He stopped at a motel 2 hours from Chicago. If he wanted to disappear, he would have gone much farther. He's waiting. He's looking for a safe place to negotiate, or waiting to see who contacts him first, you or Alistair." She stopped and looked at Conrad. "If you deal with him, the timed system activates, the evidence goes to the FBI, And everything you've rebuilt over the past month collapses. The organization, the assets, all of it. That's exactly what Paxton wants if he's taken out. He'll drag the entire Ashford empire down with him. Conrad looked at her without saying anything, waiting for her to continue. Kira went on. The only safe way is to hand him over to the police. He's arrested legally. The evidence gets seized and becomes evidence in a case instead of a weapon against you. The timed system doesn't activate because he's still alive. And once the evidence is inside the legal system, you can use attorneys to control the direction of the investigation, to decide what gets exposed and what doesn't. She looked straight into Conrad's eyes. He thinks you'll act on instinct. Don't let him be right. Silence. The wind moved through the industrial district, carrying the sound of metal knocking somewhere inside the abandoned warehouses around them. Conrad looked at Kira, then he looked at Warren. Warren stayed silent for a moment, then slowly nodded. She's right. This is the safest move. And the smartest. Conrad stood there for another 10 seconds. 10 long seconds in the cold night. He was standing between two roads he had known his entire life. The old road, the road he had walked since he was 25 years old. Fast, ruthless, effective. And another road, the road a night shift nurse had just shown him. A road that required patience, required faith in a system he had never trusted. Then he said, "Call the Milwaukee police. Report Paxton Mercer's location. Give them enough information to justify an arrest. Warren, prepare the legal team." Warren looked at him for another second, then pulled out his phone and started making calls. That was the first time in 8 years at the head of the Ashford Empire that Conrad chose the law instead of force. Not because he had suddenly become a good man, not because he believed in justice, but because Kira Donovan had shown him there was another way, a way he had never considered, and this time, it was also the smartest strategic move. Kira stood beside him in the cold night of the industrial district and said nothing more. She didn't need him to thank her. She didn't need him to admit she was right. She only needed him to choose correctly, and he had chosen. Paxton Mercer was arrested by Milwaukee police at the motel the next morning. All the evidence he had brought with him was seized and became evidence in a federal criminal case. The timed system never activated. Warren's legal team controlled the direction of the investigation, making sure that what needed to be made public was made public, and what didn't need to be revealed stayed buried inside the case file. Garrett Ashford was sentenced to a long prison term, with no possibility of appeal. The federal court handled the proceedings behind closed doors, quickly and cleanly. He walked into the courtroom with the empty eyes of a man who had already lost before the trial began. Not because of the law, but because his grandmother had turned her back on him. Alistair Crane lost his ally, lost his financial channels, lost his man inside the Ashford organization. He withdrew from the northern territory of Chicago, without Conrad needing to say another word. Sometimes the silence after a victory is more frightening than any threat. In the months that followed, Conrad began to change. Not completely. He was still Conrad Ashford, still cold, still controlled, still capable of making people afraid the moment he stepped into a room. But he began moving part of the organization's operations into legitimacy: real estate investment funds, community development projects for poor neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. Places where money had once flowed into darkness now saw that money flow into schools, into roads, into infrastructure. Warren asked him why. Conrad answered, "I want to build something that doesn't need to be protected by force, something that can survive even when I'm gone." He said nothing more, but Warren understood. Kira had changed the way Conrad saw the world, not through lectures or morality, but through her existence, through the way she acted, through the way she chose what was right every single time without needing anyone to tell her. As for Kira, she opened a free clinic in Pilsen, the neighborhood where she had once rented a room, where she had once walked to the subway station every night to get to her hospital shift. The clinic was small, with only 3 exam rooms, 1 waiting room, and a play area for children. She served homeless people and children in the foster care system, children like she had once been, moving from one house to another, never knowing where they belonged. On opening day, the Chicago sky was warm and bright, rare for that season. Kira stood in front of the clinic doors, watching children run inside, laughing, healthy, holding balloons handed out by volunteers. She looked at them and saw herself from 20 years ago, but a different version, a version welcomed instead of passed on. Conrad came to stand beside her. He didn't arrive with a convoy of black cars or a team of guards. He drove alone, parked at the corner, and walked over. He placed a small box wrapped in black cloth into her hand. Kira opened it. Inside was a silver key, engraved along the stem with a small line of words, "For the woman who saved me, so she can save many more." Kira held the key, her fingers brushing over the engraved words. Her eyes grew wet. She said softly, "Do you know what I wished for most when I was little? Not toys, not a family. I only wished for a place where, when I walked in, someone would say, 'You're home.'" Conrad looked at her. His eyes, the eyes half of Chicago didn't dare meet, softened in a way only Kira ever saw. He said, "You're home." Kira smiled, tears running down her cheeks, but it was still a smile. They stood in front of the small clinic in a poor Chicago neighborhood, the Mafia boss and the orphaned nurse. Two imperfect people from two worlds no one would have thought could ever meet. But they had found each other in the darkest cold cellar, and they had chosen to stay. Not because life was easy, but because they had gone through enough darkness to know that the most precious light is the light you choose for yourself. Sometimes kindness doesn't need power to change the world. Sometimes it only needs one person brave enough to walk into the dark and say, "I'm not leaving." Kira Donovan was that person, and Conrad Ashford, the man who had never trusted anyone, learned that the greatest weakness can sometimes be the strongest form of salvation. Life doesn't always give us a perfect beginning, but it always gives us a choice. The choice to speak when we could stay silent. The choice to stay when we could walk away. The choice to trust when the whole world has taught us to doubt. And sometimes, just one right choice made by one ordinary person is enough to change an entire empire. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it so more people can hear it. How did this story make you feel? Which character moved you the most? Leave a comment and share what you feel from deep in your heart. We're always listening, and we truly treasure every single line you write. And if you want to follow the next stories, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any video. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, calm days beside the people you love. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.